Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing on a dusty, sun-baked hill in southeastern Turkey. The year is 1994. An archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt is kicking at the dirt, looking at some strange rectangular stones poking out of the earth. Local farmers had been plowing around them for generations, thinking they were just old Byzantine graves. But Schmidt notices something different about the way the flint flakes are scattered across the ground. He starts to dig. And what he finds over the next few years doesn't just rewrite the history books. It completely tears them up, throws them in a campfire, and forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew about human nature. He uncovered Gobekli Tepe, a massive, staggering complex of circular stone enclosures, featuring towering T-shaped pillars, some standing up to 18 feet tall and weighing as much as 20 tons. And they are completely covered in bizarre, intricate carvings of menacing animals. Scorpions, lions, vultures, wild boars. But here is the catch. The absolute mind-bending catch that kept archaeologists awake at night. Gobekli Tepe was built 11,600 years ago. To put that into perspective, this place is older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. When the Great Pyramid of Giza was being built, Gobekli Tepe was already ancient history. In fact, it was older to the ancient Egyptians than the ancient Egyptians are to us today. But it's not just the age that makes it impossible. It is who built it. According to everything we knew about human evolution, the people alive in 9600 BC were nomadic hunter-gatherers. They didn't have writing. They didn't have the wheel. They didn't have metal tools. They didn't even have pottery yet. And most importantly, they did not have agriculture. They were supposed to be wandering around in small, isolated bands of 20 or 30 people, hunting gazelle and picking wild berries, just struggling to survive the end of the last ice age. Yet, somehow, these scattered groups of ancient humans came together in the thousands. They organized a massive labor force. They carved monolithic stones out of the solid bedrock, hauled them up a hill, and built the world's first megalithic temple. How? How did people whose entire daily existence revolved around chasing their next meal suddenly organize a multi-generational construction project? The sheer logistics of it shouldn't be possible. You can't just send an email to the neighboring tribe and ask them to show up on Tuesday to haul a 20-ton rock. You need a way to communicate a shared vision. You need a way to feed hundreds of exhausted workers. You need engineers, artists, and leaders. For decades, the golden rule of human history was simple. First, humans figured out how to farm. Farming gave us a surplus of food. That surplus allowed us to stay in one place, which led to villages, which led to cities, which finally gave us the free time to invent religion, build temples, and create complex societies. Agriculture first, civilization second. But Gobekli Tepe flips that entire script on its head. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, we had it completely backward. What if the desire to build a massive temple came first? What if the need to worship, to gather, and to build something greater than ourselves was the actual spark that ignited human civilization? To understand how they pulled off this architectural miracle, with nothing but stone tools and sheer human will, we have to zoom in on the dirt, the sweat, and the limestone. We have to look at the ingenious, brutal methods these ancient builders used to bend the earth to their will. Listen to the rhythmic, deafening echo of stone striking stone. Hundreds of hands are at work, blistering and bleeding under the glaring Mesopotamian sun. To understand the sheer scale of what is happening here, you have to forget about cranes, pulleys, and steel chisels. The builders of Gobekli Tepe were working strictly in the Stone Age. Their toolkits consisted of flint and obsidian, volcanic glass that can be flaked to an edge sharper than a modern surgical scalpel, but is also incredibly brittle. So, how do you carve a massive, perfect T-shaped pillar out of solid bedrock using only other rocks? The answer is brute force and agonizing patience. The builders didn't carve the stone from the sides. They carved down into the bedrock, creating a deep trench around the outline of the pillar. They used harder, fist-sized stones to pound and chip away the softer limestone, millimeter by millimeter. Once the top and sides were shaped, they had to carefully undercut the massive block to snap it free from the earth. We actually know exactly how they did this, because archaeologists found an unfinished pillar still sitting in the limestone quarry just a quarter mile from the main site. It is 18 feet long and weighs an estimated 50 tons. For whatever reason, it cracked during the extraction process, and the ancient workers simply walked away from it. But let's talk about the pillars that didn't crack, the ones that weigh between 10 and 20 tons. A 20-ton block of limestone is equivalent to the weight of about 10 mid-sized cars. And these ancient people had to move it up a hill. They didn't have wheels. They didn't have domesticated draft animals like oxen or horses. They didn't even have paved roads. Imagine the engineering nightmare of this operation. You have a fragile, intricately carved monolith that took months to shape. One slip, one dropped corner, and the stone shatters, wasting countless hours of intense labor. They likely used a combination of wooden rollers, made from local trees, and thick ropes braided from plant fibers and animal hides. It would have required a highly synchronized team of hundreds of people pulling together, inch by agonizing inch, guided by someone shouting commands to keep the physical rhythm. And this brings us to the most staggering logistical problem of all: calories. If you have a workforce of 500 or 1,000 people carving, hauling, and erecting these stones, none of those people are out foraging for their own food. But dragging a 20-ton rock up an incline burns an astronomical amount of energy. They needed meat, and they needed lots of it. Archaeologists excavating the site found the answer to this problem in the ancient trash. Literally. They discovered massive refuse pits filled with tens of thousands of animal bones. And not just any bones. These were overwhelmingly wild gazelle, along with wild boar, red deer, and wild sheep. The bones showed clear-cut marks, indicating they had been butchered, cooked, and eaten in massive feasts. This wasn't just a construction site. It was a prehistoric barbecue on a scale the world had never seen. To feed this army of laborers, highly coordinated hunting parties had to be dispatched into the surrounding plains. They were likely driving entire herds of gazelle into natural traps or ambushes, harvesting meat by the ton to fuel the workforce. This requires a level of social organization that scientists used to think was absolutely impossible for hunter-gatherers. You need hunters, butchers, cooks, toolmakers, stone carvers, and haulers. You need a clear hierarchy. You need leaders who can organize the labor and manage the distribution of food so that nobody starves and the work keeps going. But what kind of leader could command that kind of authority in a world without kings, without governments, and without money? What invisible force was powerful enough to convince fiercely independent nomadic tribes to lay down their spears, pick up stone hammers, and work themselves to the bone? The answer isn't found in the dirt or the animal bones. It is etched directly into the massive pillars themselves, in a language of predators and ancient spirits. Step inside one of these circular stone enclosures as the sun goes down. Imagine the flickering orange glow of a central campfire dancing across the towering T-shaped pillars. In that shifting, shadowy light, the stones seem to physically come alive. You are surrounded by a silent menagerie of terror. Spiders creeping along the edges, scorpions poised to strike, snakes winding their way up the cold limestone, wild boars with massive bared tusks, foxes caught in mid-leap, and everywhere, vultures. Notice what is missing from this picture. These aren't the docile animals they were eating for dinner. You won't find many gazelles or sheep carved on these walls. These are the predators, the scavengers, the venomous, lethal creatures of the ancient night. Why spend thousands of grueling hours carving a deadly scorpion instead of the deer that keeps your family alive? In the modern world, we use writing to record our history. But these people were thousands of years away from inventing the alphabet. These carvings were their holy books. They are deeply embossed symbols, representing a shared, complex mythology. Think of how a modern person can look at a red octagon and immediately know to stop, or look at a cross and understand an entire theology without reading a single word. That is exactly what these animals were, a universal, visual language. They were totems, or fierce guardians, warding off evil. Take Pillar 43, for example, often called the vulture stone. It shows a headless man next to a massive bird, hinting at an ancient narrative about death and the journey of the soul to the afterlife. And what exactly were these stone beasts protecting? To understand that, you have to look closely at the massive T-shape of the pillars themselves. They aren't just abstract blocks holding up a roof. They are stylized, towering human beings. If you look at the narrow sides of the largest central pillars, you will see arms carved in low relief. Long, spindly fingers wrap around the front of the stone, resting just above a deeply carved loincloth made of fox skin. They wear belts adorned with mysterious buckles, yet they have no faces, no eyes, no mouths. Just a massive, blank, horizontal stone head. Are they gods of the underworld? Are they ancient mythical ancestors watching over the tribes? We may never know their names, but they are arranged in a deliberate circle, looking inward at two even larger dominant figures looming in the very center of the room. This is where the true, breathtaking brilliance of Gobekli Tepe shines. The cognitive leap required to pull this off is staggering. Different bands of wandering nomads, people who likely spoke different dialects and fiercely defended different territorial claims, all held this exact same complex blueprint in their minds. They shared a vast, unseen cosmology. This shared belief system was the ultimate social glue. It allowed absolute strangers to trust each other. It turned a barren hill into a neutral safety zone, a prehistoric cathedral where rival tribes could lay down their spears, feast together, and build something monumental. But this shared belief system wasn't just about telling campfire stories. Religion, especially at the untamed dawn of humanity, often had a much darker, visceral edge. Because when archaeologists dug deeper into the dirt filling these enclosures, they found something that sent a chill down their spines. Something proving these builders were deeply obsessed with the thin veil between the living and the dead. They found fragments of human skulls, heavily etched with intentional, unnatural grooves. And the terrifying implications of what these skulls were used for would lead scientists to an even bigger, world-changing realization. When you hear the phrase skull cult, your brain probably goes straight to dark Hollywood horror movies. But in the ancient world, it meant something entirely different. When archaeologists examined the skull fragments pulled from Gobekli Tepe, they didn't find random damage from a hunt or a battle. They found deep, intentional linear grooves carved right into the bone, running from the bottom to the top. They even found drill holes. Why? Because these skulls weren't just buried in the dirt to be forgotten. They were hung up on display. They were tied to those massive stone pillars by cords, suspended like morbid ancient chandeliers. To the people who built this place, a human head wasn't just a body part. It was the absolute seat of the soul. Whether these were the venerated skulls of beloved ancestors kept around to watch over the tribe, or the severed heads of defeated enemies displayed as a brutal warning, one thing is crystal clear. This site was the focal point of an intensely powerful, deeply ritualistic society. But intense rituals have a massive hidden cost. Let's think about the math for a second. You have thousands of pilgrims showing up generation after generation. They are hauling stones, carving limestone, and throwing massive gazelle-eating festivals to fuel the labor. But nature has a strict speed limit. Even the most fertile ancient plains eventually run out of wild herds if you overhunt them. And if you are wandering for miles every day to forage wild grasses and berries, you simply cannot gather enough calories to sustain a massive, stationary construction crew. The builders of Gobekli Tepe were quite literally eating themselves out of house and home. They were facing a prehistoric logistical crisis. If they wanted to keep their sacred temple going, they had to figure out a way to hack the natural world. And that brings us to a rugged volcanic mountain called Karaka Dag, sitting just 20 miles away from the Gobekli Tepe site. If you look at the DNA of modern wheat, the exact same stuff that makes up the bread, pasta, and pizza dough you eat today, and you trace its genetic lineage all the way back to its absolute oldest, wildest ancestor, the trail leads right to the slopes of Karaka Dag. The timing and the location are way too perfect to be a coincidence. Right around the time these massive monoliths were being raised, someone in that immediate area figured out a cheat code for human survival. They realized that instead of spending all day wandering the hills looking for wild einkorn grass, they could just gather the seeds, bring them closer, plant them in a controlled area, and protect them. They began consciously selecting the fattest, hardiest seeds to replant the next year. Without even realizing it, they were genetically modifying a plant. They were inventing agriculture. And here is the earth-shattering climax that completely flips our understanding of human history. They didn't invent farming because they wanted to settle down, get cozy, and build houses. They invented farming because they desperately needed a reliable, scalable food source to feed the massive workforce building their temple. The thirst for the divine came first. The overwhelming human urge to gather, to worship, and to build monuments to the unseen world, that was the actual catalyst. To feed that spiritual hunger, our ancestors were forced to invent agriculture. And here is the catch. Once you plant a field of wheat, you have to stick around to water it, guard it, and harvest it. You can't be a wandering nomad anymore. You have to build a permanent village. That village eventually grows into a city, which eventually grows into an empire. Every skyscraper, every written language, every single piece of modern civilization can be traced back to this one fundamental shift. The desire to build Gobekli Tepe quite literally birthed the modern world. But if this place was so incredibly successful, if it was the sacred, beating heart of their entire universe, it leaves us with the most baffling archaeological mystery of all. Why did they suddenly decide to wipe it off the face of the earth? Around 8000 BC, after thousands of years of continuous use, the fires at Gobekli Tepe finally burned out. But the people didn't just walk away. They didn't leave these massive pillars to slowly erode in the wind and rain. Instead, they did something completely unthinkable. They buried it. And I don't mean they threw a few shovelfuls of dirt over the campfire. They completely entombed the entire complex. They hauled thousands upon thousands of cubic meters of soil, limestone chips, animal bones, and ancient trash up the hill, systematically filling in every single circular enclosure until nothing remained but a featureless, artificial mound. The physical effort required to bury Gobekli Tepe was almost as monumental as the effort it took to build it in the first place. Why go through all that agonizing trouble? Why purposely erase your own architectural masterpiece? Some archaeologists believe this was a ceremonial decommissioning. Think about how we treat sacred objects today. When a religious text or a national flag becomes worn out, you don't just throw it in the garbage, you ritually retire it. You burn it or bury it with respect. For the ancients, when a specific enclosure had served its spiritual purpose, or perhaps when the leader who commissioned it passed away, it couldn't just be abandoned. It had to be carefully put to rest. But there is another, even more fascinating theory, one directly tied to the agricultural revolution we just talked about. As the centuries passed, these people slowly transformed into full-time farmers. Their daily relationship with the natural world fundamentally changed. They no longer relied on hunting fierce, wild predators. They relied on the predictable, quiet cycles of rain, soil, and domesticated crops. The terrifying animal spirits carved into those pillars, the deadly scorpions, the charging wild boars, the scavenging vultures, they belonged to a harsh, unpredictable hunter-gatherer world that no longer existed. The old gods simply weren't needed anymore. In order to step fully into the future, into the age of agriculture and eventually cities, they had to literally bury their past. And by burying it, they accidentally preserved it for us, locked away in a perfect, subterranean time capsule for 11 millennia. When Klaus Schmidt brushed that first layer of dirt off a T-shaped pillar, he wasn't just finding old rocks. He was waking up the very first ghosts of human ambition. For centuries, we viewed our prehistoric ancestors as simple brutes, driven entirely by biology, just reacting to their environment, fighting off the cold, and chasing their next meal. We thought complex society was something we stumbled into purely by accident once we figured out how to farm. Gobekli Tepe shatters that illusion forever. It proves that before we ever planted a single field, before we ever forged a metal sword, and long before we invented the wheel, we were dreamers. We were storytellers. We looked out into the terrifying, chaotic darkness of the ancient world, and instead of just hiding in a cave, we decided to build a monument to it. The urge to connect, to share a complex belief, and to physically carve our imagination into the bedrock of reality isn't a byproduct of civilization. It is the prerequisite. It is the most fundamentally human thing we do. What do you think those ancient builders would say if they could see the massive, modern world their stone temples set into motion? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey back to the dawn of humanity, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. There are still so many ancient mysteries left to uncover, and I can't wait to explore them with you. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep asking questions.